My daughter looked straight at me and said something no child should ever say to their own mother. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't hesitate. She didn't look conflicted. She simply said, "Find somewhere else to die. You're useless now." For a moment, I honestly thought I had misunderstood her. Grief does strange things to the mind, and I had buried my husband just weeks earlier. I waited for her to laugh, to soften her words, to tell me she didn't mean it that way. But she didn't. She crossed her arms, glanced at her watch, and sighed as if I were the one causing a delay. "You should be done packing soon," she added. "We have plans." That was the moment reality hit me. This wasn't an argument. This wasn't a misunderstanding. My daughter had already decided I no longer belonged in her life. Just 3 hours earlier, I had been standing in my kitchen, washing a mug I'd owned for decades, thinking about what to make for dinner, even though I was eating alone now. 3 hours later, my life had been reduced to 2 suitcases and a small cardboard box filled with photographs I couldn't bring myself to throw away. 43 years of marriage, a lifetime of motherhood, all of it condensed into something I could carry in my hands. She told me she owned everything now. The house, the money, the future. She said her father had left it all to her, and she said it with a confidence so cold and practiced that it felt rehearsed. When I tried to speak, she cut me off. "You wouldn't even know how to manage that kind of money," she said. "You were just the wife, as if decades of love, sacrifice, and loyalty were nothing more than background noise." Then she pressed $200 into my hand. Cash, folded neatly. "This should cover you for a few days," she said, smiling faintly. "Until you find somewhere appropriate, as if homelessness at 67 was simply an inconvenience that needed better planning." I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I didn't raise my voice. I did what I had been conditioned to do my entire life. I stayed quiet and cooperated. I sat in the back seat of her car as she drove me away from the only home I had known for decades, watching it shrink in the rearview mirror. That house had held birthday parties, late-night talks, hospital recoveries, and quiet mornings I thought would last forever. I never imagined I'd be leaving it like this. That night, I slept in a cheap roadside motel with flickering lights and walls so thin I could hear strangers breathing. I lay on a sagging mattress and stared at the ceiling, replaying her words over and over, asking myself how a daughter learns to discard her own mother so completely, so efficiently, without a second thought. What she didn't know was that something had shifted inside me that night. 3 days later, the phone rang, and her voice on the other end was shaking. The confidence was gone. The control was gone. She wasn't telling me to leave anymore. She was begging for my help, because she had made one fatal mistake. She thought I was weak. She thought I was ignorant. She thought I had no power left. What she never considered was what happens when a woman who has lost everything finally stops being afraid. 1. The mother I was before everything broke. Before all of this happened, before suitcases and motel rooms and phone calls filled with panic, I was just a wife and a mother who believed she had done everything right. I wasn't extraordinary. I wasn't ambitious in the way people admire from a distance. I was dependable. I was present. I was the kind of woman people describe as lucky because she had a long marriage and a successful child. I met my husband when I was young, back when life felt wide open and forgiving. He was confident, driven, already thinking 10 steps ahead while I was still learning who I wanted to be. I loved that about him. I loved that he seemed to know where we were going. When we married, I believed partnership meant compromise, and compromise slowly turned into me stepping aside so he could step forward. It never felt dramatic at the time. It felt practical. I worked small jobs here and there. Nothing glamorous, nothing permanent. Whenever a decision had to be made about whose career mattered more, the answer was always obvious. His work paid better. His work had potential. Mine was flexible. So I adjusted. I always adjusted. I told myself I would return to my plans later, when things were more stable, when our daughter was older, when there was more time. There was always another reason to wait. Our daughter was born into a home that ran smoothly because I made sure it did. I packed lunches, attended school events, remembered birthdays, managed the household, and filled in the gaps no one else noticed. I became the quiet engine that kept everything moving. My husband appreciated it, in his way. He wasn't unkind, just distant, absorbed in building something bigger than us. I told myself that was enough. As my daughter grew, she absorbed the dynamics of our family without anyone ever explaining them. She saw her father as the decision-maker, the authority, the source of stability. She saw me as the background presence, always available, always accommodating. I don't think she meant to diminish me. She simply learned who mattered by watching who was listened to. When she married well and started a life filled with comfort and status, I was proud of her. I told everyone how capable she was, how independent, how strong. I never noticed how easily she dismissed my opinions or spoke over me when money came up. I laughed it off. I told myself it was generational, that things had changed, that she was simply more confident than I had ever been allowed to be. Over the years, I became invisible in small, almost polite ways. Decisions were made around me instead of with me. Conversations shifted when I entered the room. I was included, but not consulted. I was valued, but not respected. And because nothing was openly cruel, I accepted it. I told myself this was what a successful family looked like. Everyone had their role, and mine was to support, to smooth things over, to make life easier for everyone else. When my husband died, the ground beneath me disappeared. He had been my anchor for over 4 decades. Even in his emotional distance, he had provided structure, identity, and security. Without him, I felt unmoored, unsure of where I stood or who I was supposed to be. I leaned into grief because it was familiar. It was safe. It didn't require decisions. That was when my daughter stepped forward, offering help with a smile that looked like concern. She spoke gently, reassuringly, telling me not to worry, telling me she would handle everything, and I let her, because that's what I had always done when someone sounded confident. I stepped back and trusted that the people I loved would take care of me the way I had taken care of them. I didn't realize that for years, I had been teaching them exactly how much I was willing to tolerate. I had confused patience with strength, silence with loyalty, and sacrifice with love. I had spent a lifetime proving that I didn't need much in return, and eventually, they believed me. Before the betrayal, before the shock, before the humiliation, I was a woman who believed that giving everything would one day be enough. I believed that love, once earned, couldn't be revoked. I believed that being needed meant being valued. And I believed that the life I helped build would never turn around and tell me I no longer belonged in it. I was wrong. 2. His death. And the moment my daughter changed. My husband's death was sudden, the kind that leaves no room for preparation or goodbyes. One moment he was complaining about the weather, and the next he was gone, leaving behind a silence that felt louder than any argument we had ever had. After 43 years together, I didn't know how to exist in a world where he wasn't taking up space beside me. I moved through the days like a guest in my own life, doing things out of habit rather than intention. The house felt too large without him. Every room carried echoes of routines we had repeated for decades. His chair at the table remained empty, but I couldn't bring myself to move it. I slept in the guest room because our bedroom felt unbearable, as if staying there would make his absence permanent. Grief stripped away my sense of time. Days blurred together, and I stopped noticing how much I was leaning on the people around me. That was when my daughter began to appear more often. At first, it felt comforting. She arrived with food, soft words, and a tone of voice that sounded caring. She hugged me a little longer than usual and told me not to worry about anything. She said I had been strong for long enough and that it was time for her to take over. I wanted to believe her. I needed to believe her. She started pointing out practical concerns. The house was too big for me, she said. The stairs were dangerous. The memories were unhealthy. She spoke as if she were worried about my well-being, but there was something about the way she said it that made me uneasy. She didn't ask how I felt. She told me how I felt. She framed every suggestion as if it were already decided. Soon, her visits stopped being casual. She brought her husband with her, and their conversations shifted into a tone I recognized but couldn't quite name at the time. They spoke in low voices at the table, exchanging glances when I entered the room. Real estate brochures appeared on the counter. Pamphlets about retirement communities were left open where I couldn't miss them. She talked about convenience, independence, and freedom, but she never asked me if that was what I wanted. I noticed how quickly she stepped into her father's role. She handled phone calls, paperwork, and appointments without consulting me. When people asked questions, she answered for me. When I tried to contribute, she interrupted gently, correcting me with a smile that suggested she was helping. "Mom's been through a lot," she would say. "I'll take care of it, if you recorded." Something about that sentence unsettled me. But grief has a way of dulling instincts. I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself she was simply being efficient. I told myself that family doesn't betray family. The change wasn't dramatic. It was subtle, almost professional. She stopped asking and started informing. She spoke about my life as if it were a project that needed managing. Her concern felt rehearsed, as though she had practiced sounding sympathetic. The warmth I was used to was replaced by something sharper, something impatient. I began to feel like a problem that needed solving rather than a mother who needed support. When I expressed hesitation, she brushed it aside. She reminded me how overwhelmed I was, how fragile I seemed. She spoke about responsibility and made it sound like a burden she was generously carrying for me. Each time, I stepped back, unsure of myself, doubting my own judgment. Grief had made me malleable, and she knew it. Looking back, I can see the moment she stopped seeing me as a person and started seeing me as an obstacle. My husband had been gone for weeks, and already she was rearranging the pieces of a life that wasn't hers. She spoke of the future with certainty, and I realized she was making plans that didn't include my voice. I still didn't believe she would hurt me. I believed in the version of my daughter I had raised, the child who once needed me to read her stories at night and hold her hand when she was afraid. I couldn't reconcile that child with the woman who was slowly taking control of everything I owned. Grief made me quiet. Trust made me blind. By the time I sensed that something was wrong, it was already too late. She had stepped fully into the space my husband left behind, and in doing so, she had begun to rewrite my place in the family. I thought I was being cared for. In reality, I was being replaced. 3. The day I was thrown out of my own home. The day my daughter forced me out of my house did not begin with shouting or chaos. It began quietly, which somehow made it worse. I was standing at the kitchen sink, rinsing a plate I hadn't used, when I heard the front door open. I assumed it was another unannounced visit, another conversation about what was best for me. I dried my hands on a towel and turned around, ready to nod and agree the way I always did. That's when I saw the suitcases. 2 large ones, expensive, new, standing upright in the entryway like punctuation marks at the end of a sentence. My daughter stood beside them with her husband, both of them calm, composed, almost businesslike. She smiled at me, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Mom," she said, as if we were about to discuss dinner plans. "We need to talk." Something in my chest tightened. I looked from the suitcases to her face, trying to understand what I was seeing. Before I could ask a question, she spoke again. "We've made a decision. Not I've been thinking. Not how do you feel. A decision." She explained that her husband had received an opportunity and that they needed to move immediately. She gestured vaguely around the room. "This house makes sense for us," she said. "It's closer to everything. The kids will have more space." I laughed softly, because I truly believed she was joking. "Move in?" I asked. "But this is my home." That was when her expression changed. Just for a second, the warmth slipped, and something colder surfaced, something calculating. "Actually," she said, "according to your husband's will, I inherited everything." The words didn't land all at once. They came apart slowly, each one cutting deeper than the last. The house, the accounts, everything. She said it with confidence, like someone repeating facts they had memorized. "I've been letting you stay here out of kindness," she continued, "but it's time for you to find your own place." I felt dizzy. "There must be a mistake," I said. "Your father would never." She cut me off. "There's no mistake. He knew I'd handle things better than you." Better. As if love and loyalty were skills I lacked. She went on, explaining how I didn't understand finances, how managing property was too much for me, how I should be grateful she was handling this so smoothly. Her husband avoided my eyes, already lifting one of the suitcases as if the conversation were over. Then she said it. "Find somewhere else to die. You're useless now." It wasn't said in anger. That's what haunted me. It was said with finality, as if she were stating the weather, as if my usefulness had expired. I stood there, surrounded by a life I no longer recognized, trying to process how 43 years of marriage and motherhood could be erased so quickly. I wanted to scream. I wanted to demand proof, to call someone, to fight, but grief had hollowed me out, and shock sealed the rest. So I packed. I packed quietly, methodically, the way I used to pack lunches and suitcases for family vacations. Clothes first, then toiletries, then photographs, because they were the only things she hadn't tried to take from me yet. 43 years fit into 2 suitcases and 1 small box. She stood in the doorway the entire time, checking her phone, sighing occasionally as if I were inconveniencing her. At one point, she suggested a senior complex she had heard good things about. She used the same tone she once used to recommend restaurants. Her husband loaded my bags into their car with efficiency, like someone clearing out unwanted items. Before I got in, she pressed $200 into my hand. Cash, folded neatly. "This should cover a few days," she said. "Once we finish sorting your father's paperwork, I'll transfer some money." Some money. From what she believed was mine. As we drove away, I looked back at the house. The windows reflected the afternoon sun, warm and familiar. That house had seen birthdays, illnesses, late-night talks, and quiet mornings I thought would never end. I had scrubbed its floors, painted its walls, filled its rooms with care, and now I was leaving it without a key. They dropped me off at a budget motel on the edge of town, the kind of place people don't look at twice. She handed me the room key without meeting my eyes and told me to call her once I got settled. Then she drove away. I stood there for a long moment, holding my suitcases, listening to traffic pass by, realizing that in the span of one afternoon, I had gone from being a grieving widow to being homeless, not because of strangers, not because of bad luck, but because of my own child. Inside the room, the air smelled stale. The bed sagged in the middle. The walls were thin enough that I could hear voices from the next room. I sat on the edge of the mattress and stared at the door, half expecting someone to knock and tell me this was all a misunderstanding. No one came. That night, as I lay awake under a flickering light, one thought repeated itself over and over. If my daughter could do this to me so easily, then the woman I thought I was might never have existed at all. And somewhere beneath the shock and the grief, something else began to stir. A quiet, unfamiliar feeling. Doubt. Not doubt about myself, but doubt about everything she had told me. 4. The night in the motel. That first night in the motel felt unreal, like I had stepped into someone else's life by mistake. The room was small and dim, lit by a buzzing lamp that flickered every few seconds as if it were struggling to stay awake. The air smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals and something older, something that had settled into the walls over time. I set my suitcases down beside the bed and stood there, unsure of what to do next, as though the rules of my life had suddenly changed and no one had explained the new ones to me. I sat on the edge of the mattress, which dipped beneath my weight, and listened. Cars passed outside. A door slammed somewhere down the row of rooms. A television murmured through the thin wall next to mine. All of it felt too loud, too close, too exposed. In my house, there had always been space, privacy, a sense that I belonged where I was. Here, I felt temporary, like someone waiting to be moved along. I opened one of my suitcases and stared at the clothes inside. They were familiar, folded the way I had always folded them. But they looked wrong in this room. Out of place. I wondered how long it would take before this began to feel normal, and the thought frightened me more than the situation itself. I lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling, watching the light cast uneven shadows above me. My mind replayed the afternoon over and over, every word my daughter had said, every glance, every pause. I tried to find the moment where I had misunderstood something, where this could still be fixed if I approached it differently. But no matter how I rearranged the memory, the outcome stayed the same. She had been certain. That certainty gnawed at me. It wasn't the behavior of someone improvising or acting out of emotion. It was the confidence of someone who believed they were standing on solid ground. Someone who had proof, and that was when the doubt I had felt earlier began to sharpen. My husband had been many things over the years. He could be distant, absorbed in his work, stubborn when he believed he was right. But careless was never one of them. He kept records of everything. He labeled files. He planned years ahead. When it came to important matters, especially anything involving money or property, he was meticulous to the point of obsession. I remembered him showing me his will years ago, explaining his decisions in a calm, deliberate way. He wanted me to understand. He wanted me to feel secure. I remembered his voice, steady and reassuring, telling me that I would be taken care of no matter what happened. What my daughter had described didn't match that memory. I sat up slowly, my heart beginning to beat faster. If she had been wrong, then everything that had happened that day was wrong. If she had lied or been misled, then I hadn't just been pushed out of my home. I had been removed on purpose. The idea scared me. But it also did something else. It steadied me. For the first time since my husband died, my grief loosened its grip, just enough for clarity to slip through. I wasn't imagining this discomfort. I wasn't being dramatic. Something was off, and I needed to know what it was. I pulled my phone from my purse and turned it on. The motel's internet connection was slow and unreliable, but it was enough. I searched for my husband's attorney, the same man who had handled our paperwork for years. His name appeared on the screen, familiar and solid, like a lifeline. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the screen. Calling him would mean admitting that I had been cast out. It would mean asking questions I was afraid of the answers to. But staying silent had already cost me everything. That night, in a room I never imagined I would sleep in, I made a decision I should have made long ago. I would stop assuming the people around me were telling the truth, and I would find out for myself what my husband had really left behind. 5. The lawyer's office and the truth that blew everything apart. The next morning, I woke before my alarm, disoriented for a moment as I stared at the unfamiliar ceiling. Then everything came rushing back at once, the suitcases, my daughter's voice, the motel room. I sat up slowly, my body stiff from the cheap mattress, and for the first time since the day before, I felt something other than shock. I felt determined. After a quick shower that barely produced warm water, I dressed carefully, choosing clothes that made me feel like myself, not like someone who had been discarded. I counted the remaining cash in my purse twice before leaving the room. Every dollar mattered now. The bus ride into town felt longer than it should have, each stop giving me too much time to think. By the time I stepped off near the office building, my hands were shaking, but I kept walking. My husband's attorney had worked with us for decades. He had handled the purchase of our house, reviewed contracts, and managed documents my husband trusted no one else to touch. If anyone knew the truth, it would be him. His office was quiet, professional, and unchanged, which made the contrast to my life feel surreal. When I gave my name to the receptionist, she smiled politely and asked me to take a seat. I hadn't been sitting for more than a minute when the office door opened. He looked genuinely surprised to see me. "Margaret," he said, standing quickly, "I was wondering when you'd come in." The words stopped me cold. "You were?" I asked. "Yes," he said slowly. "I tried calling the house several times." My stomach tightened. "You did?" He frowned. "Your daughter said you were traveling, that you weren't up to meeting yet." Traveling. The lie landed with sickening clarity. I followed him into his office, my heart pounding louder with every step. Once the door closed, I sat across from him and folded my hands in my lap, afraid they would give me away. "I need to ask you about my husband's will," I said. He looked confused. "Of course. Didn't Victoria give you your copy?" I provided her with the original and several copies after the reading. The word hit me like a blow. "The reading?" I repeated. He stared at me, concern replacing confusion. "Margaret, you were supposed to be there." The room felt suddenly too small. "I was never told about any reading," I said. "Victoria told me she inherited everything." His expression changed instantly. The warmth faded, replaced by alarm. Without saying a word, he reached for a thick folder on his desk and opened it with urgency. "That's not possible," he said firmly. "Your husband was very clear." He pulled out a document and turned it so I could see it. I recognized my husband's signature immediately. Neat, deliberate, unmistakable. My chest tightened as he began to read. He read slowly, carefully, as if each word carried weight. My husband had left me the house. All of it. The property, the furnishings, everything inside. He had also left me the majority of his assets. A number was mentioned, one so large it took my breath away. I felt lightheaded as it sank in. Then he continued. My daughter had been left a portion, held separately, with conditions. Very specific conditions. Her inheritance depended entirely on how she treated me after his death. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. The office seemed to tilt around me. When he finished reading, silence filled the room. I swallowed hard. She told me I got nothing, I said quietly. She moved into my house. She gave me money and told me to leave. His face flushed with anger. Margaret, what she did is not just wrong. It's serious. She lied. She withheld information, and if she showed you documents, they were not legitimate. I thought of the calm certainty in my daughter's voice, the confidence with which she had dismantled my life. She was so sure, I whispered. She was gambling that you wouldn't question her, he said, and that you wouldn't come here. Then he said something that made my heart stop. There's more. He pointed to another section of the document. If my daughter failed to treat me with respect and dignity, her entire inheritance would revert to me. Not part of it. All of it. I stared at the page, tears finally blurring my vision. Are you saying? He nodded. Yes. Because of her actions, you are now the sole beneficiary. The irony was almost unbearable. In her rush to claim everything, she had triggered the very clause designed to protect me from her. For the first time since my husband died, I felt something solid beneath my feet. Grief, shock, humiliation, they were still there. But now they were joined by clarity. This wasn't a family disagreement. This was a deliberate betrayal. He leaned back in his chair and looked at me carefully. Margaret, what your daughter did has consequences. Legal ones. I thought about the motel room, the suitcases, the way she told me to find somewhere else to die, and something inside me hardened. What do I do now? I asked. He didn't hesitate. Now, we correct this, and we make sure it never happens again. As I left his office later that morning, the world looked different. The betrayal was deeper than I had imagined, but so was the truth. I had walked in believing I was powerless. I walked out knowing that everything my daughter thought she owned was never hers to take. And for the first time since she shut the door behind me, I didn't feel small. I felt awake. 6. The trap my husband left behind. I sat in the lawyer's office long after he finished explaining the will, staring at the pages as if they might change if I looked away. The words were clear. Too clear. This wasn't an accident or a vague promise interpreted generously. This was deliberate, precise, thought through. My husband had known. That realization hit me harder than the betrayal itself. For years, I had believed that I was the only one who noticed how my daughter spoke to me, how she dismissed my opinions, how easily she slipped into the role of authority while treating me like an inconvenience. I had assumed my husband either didn't see it or didn't think it mattered. I told myself he loved her too much to notice her flaws. I was wrong. He updated the will 6 months before his death, the lawyer said gently. He was very concerned about how your daughter viewed money, and about how she treated you. 6 months. While I was still planning holidays and routines, my husband had been watching, evaluating, protecting me in the only way he knew how, quietly. The lawyer explained that my husband had insisted on including specific language about dignity and respect, not vague ideas, clear expectations. He had even asked hypothetical questions, testing scenarios, making sure there was no room for interpretation. At the time, the lawyer had thought it was excessive. Now, it felt chillingly accurate. I thought back to small moments I had dismissed. Conversations where my daughter spoke over me while my husband watched silently. Dinners where she rolled her eyes at my suggestions. Comments about money that bordered on contempt. I remembered my husband's expression in those moments, not angry, not defensive, but thoughtful, measuring. He had been paying attention in ways I hadn't. A strange mix of emotions flooded me. Gratitude, sadness, regret. I had spent years assuming I needed protection from the world, when in reality, the greatest threat had been growing quietly inside my own family. My husband had seen it coming, even if I refused to. He wanted to make sure you were safe, the lawyer said. Even from her. Why? The truth settled heavily in my chest. My husband had loved our daughter, but he had not been blind. He had understood that entitlement, once left unchecked, grows into something dangerous. He had understood that kindness without boundaries invites abuse, and he had planned accordingly. As I left the office that day, I realized something else that was equally unsettling. My daughter hadn't just lied to me. She had deliberately kept me away from the reading of the will because she knew the truth would destroy her narrative. She had counted on my grief, my silence, my lifelong habit of trusting her. She had believed I would never question her authority. That belief was her mistake. Over the next few hours, everything moved quickly. Accounts were flagged, documents were reviewed, calls were made. I was no longer a passive observer in my own life. I was being consulted, asked, included. It felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable, but also empowering in a way I hadn't experienced before. And then my phone rang. Her name lit up the screen. I didn't answer at first. I watched it ring, my heart pounding, knowing that whatever version of my daughter was on the other end would not be the one I remembered. When I finally picked up, her voice was tense, rushed, stripped of its usual confidence. "Mom," she said, "there's a problem with the bank." "A problem?" I almost laughed. She started talking quickly, explaining that accounts were frozen, that there had to be some kind of mistake, that nothing made sense. She asked where I was, demanded answers, tried to reassert control through urgency. I listened quietly. When I finally spoke, my voice surprised even me. It was calm, steady, unapologetic. "I'm at your father's lawyer's office," I said. "The one you told I was traveling." Silence filled the line. "I know about the will," I continued. "The real one." Her breathing changed. I could hear it. The shift from authority to fear was subtle but unmistakable. "That's not what it says," she replied quickly. "You're confused. You're grieving." "No." That was her voice cracking, not mine. For the first time in my life, I understood exactly where the power in our relationship had always been. I had simply chosen not to use it. My husband had left her money, but more importantly, he had left me the truth. And that truth was a trap she had already walked into, believing she was untouchable. She had mistaken my patience for weakness, and now, the game she thought she was controlling had already turned against her. 7. My daughter panics. The first crack in my daughter's confidence was small, but once it appeared, everything began to fall apart quickly. After that phone call, she didn't hang up in anger the way she usually did when conversations stopped going her way. Instead, she stayed on the line, breathing unevenly, as if she were trying to regain control of a situation that was slipping through her fingers. "Mom," she said again, softer this time. "You don't understand what's happening." I almost smiled at the irony. For once, I understood perfectly. Within hours, her carefully constructed world began to show visible damage. Her credit card stopped working. Automatic payments failed. Utilities she had confidently transferred into her name were suddenly questioned. The certainty she had wielded like a weapon only days earlier evaporated, replaced by frantic calls and messages that grew more desperate by the hour. She called repeatedly. When I didn't answer, she left messages. Her tone shifted with each one. At first, she was irritated, convinced this was a temporary inconvenience. Then she became confused. By the fifth message, fear crept in, unfiltered and raw. "Mom, please call me back," she said. "There's something wrong. The bank says everything is frozen." Everything. The word she had once used so casually now carried weight. When I finally returned her call, I did so on my terms. I was seated comfortably in a quiet office, surrounded by people who spoke to me with respect and clarity. I was no longer standing in a hallway with a suitcase in my hand. "What did you do?" she demanded the moment I spoke. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply stated facts. "I found out the truth." She tried to interrupt, but I continued. I told her that I had seen the will, that I knew she had lied, that I knew she had kept me away intentionally. With each sentence, her defenses crumbled further. "That's not fair," she snapped. "You weren't in the right state of mind. I was protecting you." Protecting me. The word sounded hollow now, stripped of its authority. "You protected yourself," I said, "and you did it by throwing me out of my own home." Her breathing quickened. "I didn't mean it like that." But meaning didn't matter anymore. Actions did. She tried another approach. Her voice softened, slipping into a tone she had perfected over the years. The voice she used when she wanted something without appearing to demand it. "Mom, you know I love you. We can fix this. Let's not make it into something it doesn't need to be." Tracked. That was when I realized she still believed she could negotiate her way out of this. She believed this was a misunderstanding, a family disagreement that could be smoothed over with enough persuasion. She didn't yet understand that this wasn't about hurt feelings. It was about truth. I told her what the lawyer had explained, about the conditions attached to her inheritance, about how her treatment of me had triggered consequences she could not undo. The silence that followed was deafening. "That's impossible," she whispered finally. "He would never do that to me." "He didn't," I replied. "You did." Her composure collapsed completely then. She began talking rapidly, contradicting herself, insisting there must be another document, another version, another explanation. She blamed stress, she blamed grief, she blamed everyone but herself. And then, when none of it worked, she did what she had always done when she felt cornered. She begged. "I'll make it right," she said. "You can come back. We'll pretend none of this happened. I'll take care of you. Take care of me." As if control and care were the same thing. I closed my eyes for a moment, remembering the way she had stood in that doorway, telling me to hurry. Remembering the $200. Remembering the word useless. "No," I said quietly. The word shocked her more than anything else I had said. She wasn't used to hearing it from me. Silence followed, thick and heavy. "You can't do this to me," she said finally. "I'm your daughter." The statement was meant to stop me, to trigger guilt, obligation, fear. For years, it would have worked. But something fundamental had changed. "I am your mother," I replied. "And that's why this hurts." "But it doesn't change what you did." By the end of the call, she was no longer angry. She was scared. Truly scared. She had built her future on the assumption that I would never challenge her, never question her, never step outside the role she had assigned me. That assumption had just collapsed. When the call ended, I sat quietly for a long time, absorbing what had happened. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel cruel. I felt clear. My daughter had shown me who she was when she thought I was powerless. And now that the power had shifted, she was learning a lesson she had spent her entire life avoiding. Control without integrity always fails. And this was only the beginning. 8. The counterattack. Once my daughter's panic became real, something else happened inside me. The fear that had controlled me for weeks finally loosened its grip. In its place came focus. Not rage, not revenge. Focus. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to what was being done to me. I was choosing what would happen next. The lawyer didn't rush me. He explained my options calmly, carefully, as if grounding me in reality was part of his job. What my daughter had done wasn't just cruel. It wasn't just immoral. It crossed lines that couldn't be ignored or smoothed over with apologies. She had hidden documents, lied deliberately, and removed me from my own home under false pretenses. This wasn't family drama. This was misconduct. Hearing it framed that way changed something in me. For years, I had excused bad behavior because it came from people I loved. I had convinced myself that protecting family meant staying quiet. But sitting there, listening to the facts laid out plainly, I realized how deeply that belief had harmed me. Protecting family should never mean erasing yourself. We began by documenting everything: dates, phone calls, messages, the forged paperwork she had shown me, the motel receipt, the cash she had handed me like charity. Each detail felt small on its own, but together they formed a clear picture, a pattern, a story that wasn't about misunderstanding, but intent. As the process unfolded, I noticed something unexpected. People listened to me, not politely, not impatiently. They asked questions and waited for answers. They treated my experiences as evidence, not emotion. I hadn't realized how starved I was for that kind of respect. The lawyer explained that accounts would remain frozen while ownership was clarified. That alone sent shockwaves through my daughter's life. Her confidence had always rested on access money, status, control. With those cut off, she was exposed in a way she had never experienced. Her husband tried to intervene next. He called me later that evening, his tone smooth and measured, like someone trying to negotiate a business deal. He spoke about stress, about confusion, about mistakes made under pressure. He never apologized. Not once. Instead, he implied that things had gone too far and suggested that involving outside parties would only create unnecessary trouble. "Your family," he said. "We can resolve this privately." I listened without interrupting, letting him talk himself into a corner. When he finally paused, waiting for my agreement, I said something that clearly surprised him. "No. He tried again, changing tactics. He talked about my age, about how overwhelming this must be for me, about how difficult it would be to manage everything on my own. The implication was clear. I was fragile. I needed guidance. From him, I recognized the pattern immediately. It was the same one my daughter had used, the same language, the same assumption. "I'm managing just fine," I said, "and this is no longer a private matter." The call ended shortly after that. That night, I went back to the motel, but it no longer felt like a place of exile. It felt temporary, transitional. I slept better than I had in weeks, not because things were resolved, but because I had finally stopped surrendering control. The next day brought consequences. My daughter's access to funds remained blocked. Requests were denied. Explanations were demanded. The story she had told herself that she could take what she wanted and sort out the details later collapsed under scrutiny. Every attempt she made to regain control only exposed her further. She called again. This time, there was no anger left, only urgency. "We need to talk," she said. I agreed, but not on her terms. The meeting took place with witnesses present, in an environment where she couldn't manipulate the narrative. The moment she realized that, her posture changed. Her confidence drained away, replaced by defensiveness and disbelief. She tried to paint herself as overwhelmed, as well-meaning, as misunderstood. She framed her actions as decisions made under emotional strain. But when faced with clear questions why she lied, why she excluded me, why she removed me from my home, her explanations unraveled. There was no version of events where her behavior made sense. When the conversation ended, it was clear that whatever relationship we had before no longer existed. She had crossed a line that couldn't be stepped back over, and for the first time, she seemed to understand that. As I walked away from that meeting, I felt a mixture of grief and resolve. Grief for the daughter I thought I had, resolve to protect the woman I was becoming. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't punishment driven by anger. It was accountability, long overdue. I had spent my life absorbing discomfort to keep others comfortable. I had mistaken endurance for virtue. That era was over. The counterattack wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was steady, deliberate, and grounded in truth. And for the first time, I wasn't bracing for the fallout. I was prepared for it. Because no matter what came next, one thing was certain. I would never allow myself to be erased again. 9. The dark secret about my husband. Just when I thought the worst revelations were behind me, the ground shifted again. A few days after the confrontation with my daughter, the lawyer called and asked me to come in. His voice was careful, measured in a way that immediately made my stomach tighten. This wasn't about my daughter anymore. This was about my husband. When I arrived, his office felt different. He closed the door gently and sat across from me, without opening a file right away. That alone told me something was wrong. "There's something you need to know," he said. I nodded, bracing myself. By that point, I thought I was prepared for anything. I was wrong. As we began going through my husband's records in detail, patterns started to emerge that I hadn't noticed before. Transactions that didn't quite make sense. Payments to companies I didn't recognize. Large sums moving in ways that didn't match the story I had always believed about his work. At first, I assumed it was complicated business I had never been involved in. That had always been the case. But this was different. The lawyer explained slowly, choosing his words carefully. My husband's work had not been as clean or straightforward as I had believed. There were serious questions about where some of the money came from and how it moved. The possibility that my husband had been involved in illegal activity was no longer theoretical. It was real. The room felt like it was closing in on me. I shook my head. "That's not possible," I said. He wasn't like that, and I meant it. The man I had lived with for over 4 decades was disciplined, controlled, and cautious. He hated unnecessary risk. He valued stability above all else. The idea that he had built our life on something dangerous felt like a betrayal layered on top of everything else. But evidence doesn't care about belief. As the details unfolded, my memories began to shift. Late-night phone calls he took in his office. Trips he insisted I not worry about. His constant emphasis on privacy, on not discussing business with anyone. At the time, I had interpreted it as professionalism. Now, it looked different. I felt foolish, exposed, angry at myself for never asking more questions. "What does this mean for me?" I asked quietly. The answer wasn't comforting. If authorities became involved, everything could be scrutinized. The house, the money, my role. Even if I had known nothing, and I truly hadn't, ignorance didn't automatically protect me from consequences. The life I was just beginning to reclaim suddenly felt fragile again. And then came the most unsettling part. My daughter and her husband likely knew something was wrong long before I did. Her confidence, her certainty, her willingness to take such extreme action so quickly it started to make sense in a way I didn't want to admit. She hadn't just been greedy. She had been strategic. She believed she was acting before the truth came out, securing what she thought she could before everything collapsed. The betrayal deepened. I had thought her cruelty came from entitlement. Now I realized it may also have come from fear. Fear that the foundation of our family's wealth was unstable. Fear that exposure was inevitable. Fear that time was running out. That night, I went back to my motel room and sat in silence for hours. I looked at the walls, the ceiling, my packed bags, and felt something close to grief all over again. Not for my marriage this time, but for the version of my husband I thought I had known. I wasn't just mourning a man. I was mourning an illusion. I asked myself question after question. How long had this been going on? Had he ever planned to tell me? Had he believed he was protecting me by keeping me in the dark? Or had he simply assumed I didn't need to know? There were no answers, only fragments. By the end of that night, one truth became painfully clear. My daughter's actions, as unforgivable as they were, had forced open a door that had been sealed for decades, and behind it was a reality I could no longer ignore. I didn't know yet how deep the secret went. I didn't know who else might be involved. I didn't know what it would cost me to face it, but I knew this. If the past was going to come back and demand a reckoning, I would not hide from it the way everyone else had. I had already lost my home once. I wasn't about to lose myself again by pretending I didn't see the truth. 10. The final trap. The call from my daughter came late that night, long after I had stopped expecting anything but silence. Her voice was different this time. Gone was the sharpness, the authority, the certainty. What replaced it was something strained, almost rehearsed. "Mom," she said quietly, "we need to talk. Tonight." I didn't answer right away. I already knew this wasn't about reconciliation. This was about control, or rather, her attempt to regain it. "There are things you don't know about Dad," she continued. "Important things. Things that change everything." I closed my eyes. "So she did know." "I already know," I said. The pause on the other end of the line was long enough to feel. When she spoke again, her confidence was gone. "Then you understand why we need to handle this carefully." Carefully. The word felt almost insulting. She explained that her husband's legal team had been reviewing records and that certain information could draw attention they all wanted to avoid. She framed it as concern for me, for the family, for everyone involved. "If things went public," she said, "I could lose everything. The house, the money, my reputation." Then she made her offer. They would make the problems go away. The accusations, the frozen accounts, the consequences. In exchange, I would cooperate. I would stay quiet. I would accept a smaller portion and let them handle the rest. It was blackmail dressed up as compromise. For a moment, I said nothing. I could hear her breathing on the other end, waiting, calculating. She believed she finally had leverage. That fear would push me back into the role I had always played. She was wrong. "I want to meet," I said calmly. Relief flooded her voice. "Good. Kevin will be there. We'll explain everything." What she didn't know was that I wasn't walking into this meeting unprepared. I had already spoken to people who understood exactly what she was attempting to do. People who recognized extortion when they heard it. People who knew how these games were played. The meeting took place in my living room. Not hers. Mine. I wanted that detail to matter. They arrived dressed like this was a business negotiation, not a reckoning. Her husband carried a briefcase. She hugged me like nothing had happened, her performance flawless, almost convincing. Almost. They laid out their proposal carefully, emphasizing how reasonable it was, how generous, how necessary. They spoke about protecting the family, about moving forward, about avoiding unnecessary damage. I listened. I asked questions. I encouraged them to explain more. Every word they spoke tightened the trap they didn't see closing around them. When they were finished, I asked one simple question. When did you first know? They froze. When did you first know about Dad's secrets? I repeated. Before you forced me out? Or after? Her husband answered before she could stop him, and in doing so, he confirmed everything. That was the moment the room changed. I stood up slowly and told them the conversation was over. Confusion flashed across their faces, followed by something darker when they realized they had miscalculated. They tried to leave. They didn't get far. What followed was quiet, controlled, and irreversible. There were no raised voices, no dramatic gestures, just consequences arriving exactly when they should have. As they were escorted out, my daughter turned back to me, her face twisted in disbelief. "How could you do this to your own family?" she asked. I looked at her and felt nothing but clarity. "You did this," I said. "I just stopped protecting you from it. If you..." When the door closed behind them, the house was silent. I sat down in the same chair where I had once felt powerless and realized the truth. The final trap hadn't been about money or secrets. It had been about believing I would always choose silence over truth. And this time, I hadn't. 11. The outcome. The days that followed were quiet in a way I wasn't used to. Not peaceful, just still. The kind of stillness that comes after something irreversible has happened. My phone barely rang. No more frantic calls. No more messages filled with urgency or manipulation. Whatever power my daughter believed she had was gone, and she knew it. The consequences unfolded steadily, without drama. There were no shouting matches, no emotional confrontations. Just processes moving forward, one step at a time. Questions were asked, records were reviewed, timelines were established. The story my daughter and her husband had tried to control was now out of their hands. When I learned they had been formally charged, I didn't feel relief the way I expected to. I didn't feel triumph. What I felt was something closer to grief, but not the kind that makes you weak. This was grief with clarity. Grief for the relationship I thought we had. Grief for the daughter I believed would never truly hurt me. Seeing her actions laid out plainly, stripped away every excuse I had ever made for her. There was no misunderstanding, no confusion, no good intentions twisted by stress. There was planning, there was deception, and there was a willingness to sacrifice me for her own security. Her husband tried once more to reach out through intermediaries, suggesting that everything had gone too far, that families shouldn't destroy each other over mistakes. I declined to respond. At that point, words had lost their value. Only accountability mattered. When the legal process moved forward, it did so without asking for my permission or my forgiveness. And for the first time, I was grateful for that. I had spent decades being the person who softened consequences, who absorbed damage so others wouldn't have to. This time, I didn't interfere. I returned to my home shortly after. Walking through the front door felt surreal. The rooms were exactly as I had left them, but they felt different now. Lighter, quieter. The tension that had lingered for years, unnoticed but constant, was gone. I slept in my bedroom again, not because it was easy, but because it was mine. Neighbors asked gentle questions. Friends expressed shock. Some people hinted that I should try to mend things, that blood should matter more than conflict. I listened, but their words no longer carried weight. They hadn't stood in that doorway. They hadn't been told to disappear. I thought about my daughter often, but not in the way people expect. I didn't replay her childhood or search for moments I might have changed things. I didn't look for where I went wrong. For the first time, I allowed myself to accept that someone else's choices were not a reflection of my worth. When sentencing was finalized, it was brief and unceremonious. There were no speeches, no apologies that mattered, just outcomes. Afterward, I sat alone in my living room, and let the reality settle. The chapter that defined my adult life, wife, mother, caretaker, had closed in a way I never imagined. But instead of feeling empty, I felt strangely intact. What surprised me most was the absence of guilt. I had expected it to rush in eventually, to tell me I had gone too far, that I should have protected my child no matter what. But it didn't come, and in its place was something far more honest. Peace. Not happiness, not satisfaction. Peace. I hadn't destroyed my family. I had stopped allowing myself to be destroyed for it. And that made all the difference.